Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to add logging to our scraping app, just so you get a bit better of an idea of how to add logging to an application like this. By the way, I always recommend adding logging as you start your application, and not add the logging all at the end, like we've done here. When you start, as you develop, you can add logging and it'll make more sense. Once you're done, you sort of lose a bit of the bigger picture, and sometimes adding logging can be a bit more tricky. So by all means, add the logging while you develop, not all at the end. But nonetheless, in order to save you time, not to add logging every video and so forth, we add it all at the end here. But again, don't do this normally. The first thing we have to do is to import the logging module, and then we're going to configure the logging module. So we're going to do logging.basicconfig, and then in here we're going to pass in format, which is going to be the format of the logger. And this is in old Python string format syntax. You've seen this before, I've showed you this earlier. And what we're going to do is print out the current time and the current level, like debug or info and so forth. But this is always going to be 8 characters long, so that the longest level, critical, will be the same width as the shortest level, info. They're all going to be 8 spaces, and it's just going to pad with spaces at the end. Then we're going to add the file name. By the way, the S at the end just means string. It's just Python's way of assuring that what we're printing out here are strings. D is for number. And finally, we're going to add the message, which is going to be an S as well. So as you can see, our format is the time, then the level name, file name, and line number of where this was logged, and finally, the message that we logged. The date format, that's what this argument is for, is what format you want to print your dates in. %d, %m, %y is going to be date, month, and year as 4 digits, and then %h, %m, %s is going to give you hours, minutes, and seconds. So I think this is pretty good accuracy there. The level is going to be logging.debug as a start, and then we can turn it down to info or even to warning if we want. And finally, if you pass in a file name here like logs.txt, then it's just going to write all your logs to that file instead of showing them on the console. So this is normally a good idea. Then we're going to get a logger. So we're going to say logger, cannot type, logger equals logging.getLogger. And we're going to get our base logger, which is going to be called scraping. Okay, so in app.py, the logger is going to be called scraping. And as soon as you do get logger and you pass in the name, the logging module is going to create a logger in the background. In any other file, when you pass in the same name, it's going to get the same logger. So there's only one instance of a logger at any given time. This is, in case you're interested, an example of a singleton pattern in software development. This is an implementation of a singleton. If you don't know what a singleton is, don't worry. We're going to look into that much later on in the course. Okay, then we can start logging using this logger. So what can we log at line 13? Well, whenever we import something from app, we're going to run through these lines of code, then start getting the books, and then finally iterate over all the pages and get all the books in each page. What we can start logging here is that we are about to load the books list. Loading books list. By the way, my typos are generally caused by me having a microphone on my face and not being able to see my keyboard at all. So I apologize for any typos. So what we're saying here is we're loading the books list, and that's what's going to appear in our logs when we run this. Let's run the menu again. It's going to go through all of this stuff. It's going through, well, it has already gone through line 13. And it's now loaded everything. We can see, for example, the best books, and we can exit. Then you get here logs.txt. So let me open that up. You can see that this contains quite a lot of stuff. one info message at the top, are saying app.py line 13, loading books list. And then it's got a bunch of debug messages. These debug messages are not added by us. They were printed out by another library that prints out debug messages, and that's the requests library. So here it just says starting a new HTTP connection to books.toscrape.com, and then it's starting another one to books.toscrape.com, but now it's trying to get catalog/page2-html, and so forth, page 3, 4, 5, and so forth, up all the way up to 50. And as you can see, you also get the response. So that's the code 200. That means all is good. So these logs here tell you that all your requests to the page succeeded because they're all code 200. So this is good. If you don't want to see these messages because you're not interested in such a low-level operation of your application, all you have to do is turn the level up to info, and then they will disappear. Okay? So if you're showing a debug message that is only for when you're developing and you want to know exactly what's going on, use debug. If you want to give some information that is not needed, use info. And of course, if you want to talk about warnings and errors and criticals and so forth, use those levels. But normally you'll be using debug info at this level. Okay. For example, we could put a debug message here, logger.debug, creating all books page from page content. Like that. Maybe not the most necessary message, but if there is a problem between the debug message and this message here, you know that something has gone wrong retrieving the content of the page. Now, let's go over to our books page and we can do some logging in there as well. Let's go in here. Once again, all we have to do, import logging, and down here, create our logger. And inside the logger here, oh, by the way, I'm gonna make sure to use the right letter there. We're gonna say scraping dot all books page. This is going to give me a child logger of the scraping logger, the base logger that we defined earlier. And so all configuration and everything is going to be inherited. So if anything, if we'd set up anything on the scraping logger, it would also be available on this child logger. But generally, the usefulness is also to keep them related. So you know that this logger is also related to your main logger. They're part of the same application. You know, you've written them. It's not like some other library is doing the logging for you. Okay. So here we could add something like parsing page content with beautiful soup. Inside the books function, you could add something. Like that, finding all books in the page using the all books page locator.books. This is going to give you the locator in your logs. So then as you're analyzing the logs, if something goes wrong, you can look back and see what locator you tried to use and then identify if maybe it's changed now, if something does go wrong. Okay. Similarly, in the page count here, you could add some logging, logger.debug, finding all number of catalog pages available. Yeah. And then you can do things like logger.info, found number of catalog pages available. Ooh. Something like that. This is going to print an info message, so it's going to appear even if if you have debug disabled, but that can be useful. I think that printing out this message can be interesting, so that in your logs, if you do strip out the debug messages, you'll still see how many pages you're going to go through. And that can be interesting. Okay. And here we're going to debug the message that we've managed to extract the number of pages as an integer. If we fail, we know there's something wrong with our pattern or something here. Notice how, by the way, I'm putting these things around backticks. That's just to tell me that this is a value that's come from the code. It's not just a string. This will appear on the logs as backtick page 1 of 50 backtick. And then you can look at it and see, okay, this is something that's actually been printed from the code, and it's not just a string that we've printed out in the logs. So if this is, for example, like none, you maybe think there's an error there. So that's why it's in backtick. So it's a bit easier to see. Okay. We can now go to our book parser, for example, and see what we've got there. And we can again import the logging module and create our logger. And that's it. Then we can use this logger inside the module here. We could do something like this. New book parser created from the parent. And this is actually going to print out the entire HTML that you decided you wanted to create a book parser from in your code. So this is going to be a very long log because you're going to print out the entire HTML of the parent, but it can be useful for when you're debugging something that went wrong in your book parser. So I'm going to leave it as that, but you may want to print something less verbose, less HTML code in here if you are going to be using this extensively. Okay. Here we print that we're finding the book name, and then down here we're gonna say that we found it. That way, if something does happen after finding the book name, we know that is a problem here and not elsewhere in our code. And we can do the same thing for these others. So we're going to do that. Of course, changing these things. And finally, of course, we're going to print also that we found the thing. We're going to extract the price here to a variable just so we can then print it out. Found the book price. And this is going to be float price. Like that. So again, we're just adding in here the different things that we may need in order to understand what's going on through our program. So that's it. Make sure to not delete the colon there. That's going to be pretty useful. And then we are going to do this thing here. I'm just going to paste it from the code. Like that. Okay. Well, that is pretty much it for our logging. You could add some logging over to your menu if you want. It'll be fairly straightforward. There's not much logging to add in here. But we can do it just for completeness. Like that. And then we can add some logging when we try to print out. Like that. These are info messages because they're not really concerned with how the application is working or what it's doing. It's more like informative messages of what you did. So that's why I'm making them info messages. But again, this is all a matter of thinking about how you're going to look at your logs. If you're not going to look at your logs, of course, it maybe doesn't make so much sense to do any logging at all. And down here, we're going to do a debug message of terminating program. Okay, so now we can run our menu. This is going again through all of that logging for the connection handlers and, getting all the pages. And then we end up here. We can do something like B or C and then Q. Now our logs file is going to be enormous. And by the way, these logs here are there from earlier because it's now 2142. So we are going down here. These are now, we're loading the books list. This is our program starting again, the second time we ran it. We're starting to get the HTTP connection. And you can see here that in the books page, we started parsing the content with beautiful soup. Then we started finding all the books in the page using that locator. And it seems like we succeeded. And then we say new book parser created from, and then we started printing out the parent. So here we have all our article and everything that is inside that parent that we're going to extract data from. And then we moved on to the next book parser and so forth. And you can see there's quite a lot of these book parsers in here. There should be a couple of thousand, 1,000 exactly. And eventually you go down here and we say that we're finding the best books by rating. And then we're finding a book rating and we found it for a book. That was 3. Another book rating was 1 and so forth. So I'm sure you could add some more information here, like the name of the book maybe, for which this was found. Then we were finding the price, and then we found the name and so forth for the other books that we were searching for. Notice that when we print, when we call the repr method of a book, that finds the name, the price, and the rating again. So there is definitely some duplication here in our logs. But they give us all the information we need in order to understand exactly what happened. And if there was an error, for example, here, after we said finding book rating, we would know that the error is inside the rating property of our book parser. And we wouldn't have to go searching anywhere. We'd know that something's gone wrong there. So the logs can be really useful, particularly when they stop in the middle of somewhere. You don't see your terminating program or anything. They just stop suddenly. And you know that you've encountered some problem there. You normally wouldn't read all the logs. There are 31,000 lines in here. You wouldn't read them. You would just look at them when there is a problem and you'd see what has gone wrong. So having good logs is important, but sometimes, of course, particularly after we're done developing and we're sort of, confident of what's going on, we may want to decrease the logging level down to info so that we can look at the logs and more or less see what happened at each point in time. So we can do that. Then I'm going to delete logs.txt. Let's delete that. And run the menu again. And believe it or not, all this level of logging actually takes time. It slows down your application. So there's definitely something to be wary of when you do a lot of logging. Make sure that when your application is running and you need the performance to not go too far. And here we have something here. I think my rating here was an info message, but it should have been a debug. My bad. Sorry, this should have been a debug. I copy and pasted it from my notes and it was an info there. Let's delete that and run it again, just for you to look at what's happening there. And there we have it. There we have our logs. And as you can see, when we only print info, it's sort of very straightforward. We loading the books list, found the number of pages we're going through, then we found the best books by rating, and then we found them by price, and that was it. Nothing else happened, really. I'm sure there are improvements that can be made to this. You'll want to log warning messages in moments when you think you might get warnings, like if you are on a try except block. In the except block, you'll probably want to log some sort of warning or error to tell you that there was an error that happened here, but you caught it, and so forth. And of course, in some cases, you cannot deal with an error because the error happened and your program cannot continue. And in those cases, you should log a critical error, critical message to say, the program crashed at this point. You should know about that. Okay, debug and info messages, not so useful in your logs. So normally you would be on warn and above when your application is running for users in the wild. When you're developing, debug and info can be very useful. Alright, that's it for this video. I just wanted to show you really quick how to get logging into your application. Again, give you a few examples of how the logging module works and how you can just put it in anywhere you want, and then some examples of looking at your logs and what sort of things you can find. That's it for this video, and I'll see you on the next one.